All right, we're recording. Okay, so welcome again to our panel on race, gender, and anarchist cultural politics. I'm Spencer Beswick, here with Kirk Schaefer and Montse Feu. We're going to present today in chronological order of our subject matter. So I will first introduce Kirk Schaefer. Schaefer is a professor of Latin American Studies at Penn State University, Berks College. He is the author of 3 books on anarchism in the Caribbean, Anarchist Cuba, Black Flag Boric House, and Anarchists of the Caribbean, and co-editor of the award-winning edited collection, In Defiance of Boundaries, Anarchism in Latin American History, which is excellent, and I highly recommend checking it out. Kirk's talk is titled, The Multiple Uses of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality in Cuban Anarchist Culture. Thanks again, Kirk, and take it away.
All right, everyone. Well, so what I've done is I've actually modified this a little bit to think about the larger Caribbean, because I want to bring in some Caribbeanness into this as well. So let me just note that when we're talking about anarchist revolutionary culture, right, we're talking about a lot of different things as sort of prefigurative politics. We see this culture appearing in newspapers and illustrations and serializing novels and publishing poetry and all kinds of things. We see it in terms of schools. We see it in terms of vegetarian health institutes and alternative health institutes. And all of this was really about, from the anarchist standpoint, they see culture as a way of helping people understand how you can live the revolution in the present, right? How you can live the revolution in the present while also envisioning a radical future. So what I want to focus on are the novels, short stories, and plays that come from primarily writers in Cuba and in Puerto Rico. Again, seeing this as a way of reflecting the present. These were a way of critiquing the present, so they serve as a form of education. And again, also ideas of what a future might look like. So when I look at this, I see 3 broad themes, race, ethnicity, and then looking at women and gender and sexuality opens up all kinds of sub-themes that I want to explore here a little bit. Now, first of all, with race, in Cuba, race is a big issue for anarchists, though maybe not as big of an issue as it probably should have been. Afro-Cubanism was important in broader Cuban society. There was this quote unquote race war. This really is a racial massacre in 1912. And the anarchists talk about these things, but again, maybe not as much as they should. Where we really see discussions of race and Afro-Cuban culture is in novels and in the fiction, particularly those written by Adrian De Valle. For instance, here are 2, a short novel called Jubilosa, which is, and another short or a little longer novel called La Mulata Soledad, Soledad the Mulatto, all right? In both of these, the heroines of the stories are women of mixed race who don't deny their ethnicity, right? They don't deny their race. As the title character in Jubilosa says, neither am I white, even though you say that I appear to be. And I'm not going to renounce the African blood that runs through my veins, all right? And we see race popping up in different novels that De Valle is writing. Again, Jubilosa, but also The Hidden Treasure, El Tesoro Escondido, in which, Afro-Cuban anarchist is helping one of his friend's sons work the land that they live on. He's really sort of this guiding force for these young men. But there are also Afro-Cubans here too. There were real Afro-Cubans who were anarchists. One of the most important is this man. This is Raphael Serra, also known as El Abuelo, who is active throughout the teens all the way until the 1950s. I'm currently writing on Cuban anarchism in the 1950s, in the early years of the revolution into 1960 and 61. And Raphael Serra is still writing. In fact, he's actually writing in newspapers in the 50s and early 60s more than he was earlier in the teens and 20s. But I mention him because he's actually incorporated into the novel Jubilosa, in which our mulatto heroine actually, at the end of the story, falls in love with another character, a Black anarchist that simply goes by the name El Abuelo, which is, of course, Adrian De Valle's friend, Raphael Serra. Ethnicity comes into some of these stories as well. De Valle is writing sometimes about indigenous peoples. These are a couple, de maestra guerrero, from teacher to guerrilla fighter, and náufragos, shipwrecked. In the one on the left, this is set during the Mexican Revolution, and the leader, a teacher here, decides to join with his indigenous students in armed uprising, especially after white landowners rape and kill his indigenous girlfriend. On the right, Náufragos is actually set in the South Pacific. It's an anarchist who is shipwrecked. He's living on this Polynesian island where he sees people living in what he sees as harmoniously with nature. You know, they play together, there's very little work, very little hierarchical social structure, a lot of open and free nudity and sexuality. And so from his point of view, this is a harmonious living with nature that is destroyed when a capitalist US North American mining company comes in and forces all of these people to become Christians and to become laborers. He tries to lead a strike of these people. It fails miserably, and he's cast out of the islands. Now, I want to draw your attention to the graphics of these novels. They're not the most complimentary portraits of indigenous peoples or of, Afro-Cubans or mulattoes. So for instance, you see here in El Tesoro Escondido, it's just not the most flattering portrayal of a Black man. It's almost caricature. And in Jubiloso, where you got a mulatta who's a heroine, we got some weird sort of, Athenian scene here that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't go with the novel at all. Well, the problem is that De Valle and no author in the Caribbean really had any control over the graphics. These things were printed in Spain by Spanish graphic designers. So the covers really don't tell us what's going on, but the stories illustrate the importance of race and indigeneity in anarchist culture in the Caribbean. Immigration also ties into issues of ethnicity. As the anarchist in Cuba, Jose Garcia, said in 1904, let immigration come, and with it the dynamite that purifies the social environment. Well, anarchist culture is full of stories of immigrants. Some are bad, some are good. One of the key things that anarchist culture tried to get across is don't blame migrant workers for driving down wages and undermining union efforts. These are people who are coming from abroad who may not look like us, or maybe they do, but they're just trying to escape really miserable living where they come from. But when you look at this issue of migration and immigrants in anarchist culture in the Caribbean, never are Antillean migrants discussed. So for instance, in Cuba in the teens and 20s, there are large numbers of Haitian and West Indians who are working in Cuba's sugarcane fields. Well, anarchist culture doesn't address them. It really only addresses immigration from Spain. For instance, Antonio Pinochet's La Vida de un Pernicioso, in which the main character's name is Joaquin. And he's born in Spain, but he fights for Cuba in its war for independence in the 1890s. Too often, Spaniards were being portrayed as heroes, though. But Joaquin tells his audience that it's the new arrivals, the new Spanish arrivals that we should be celebrating, like anarchist workers who bring with them influences of freedom. They come to help others be free, to help remove the economic yoke that asphyxiates Cubans. So who's better when it comes to migrants? The Spaniard who sells contraband, who runs a US corporation that exploits workers, a speculator, or a worker with a conscience from Spain. Now, turning into issues of gender, women unlock all kinds of sub-themes in anarchist culture. Sometimes women are portrayed as bad mothers who sell their daughters into prostitution. Or as the image here illustrates, a woman who neglects her own child, you see clawing at her for a drink, while she is a nursemaid to a wealthy family. Or sometimes women's, what do you do if you're an anarchist, but your wife is not, and she's religious, and she's getting your children to make fun of you as a worker, as an activist? Well, Antonio Pinochet had a short story called Salvemos el Hogar, We Have to Save the Home, in which he concludes that in the harmonious home, there must exist an affinity for ideas so that through a clear explanation, all family members come to understand the humanity of our propaganda. You've got to take the women and the children, your wives and your children, to the worker centers to see plays, to hear talks, to engage, right? Education is the key. Well, prostitution is a key component in anarchist discussions of women. Pinochet's short story, The Sale of a Virgin, talks about a mother who sells her own 12-year-old daughter's virginity to a rich man. The girl ends up killing herself by throwing herself off the Malecon, the seawall in Havana. Or in Puerto Rico, you get the important anarchist Juan Villar's short story, La Ramera, about a 15-year-old factory worker who is essentially raped by her foreman and becomes pregnant. She has to quit her job and she becomes a prostitute. Prostitution here not seen as anything bad, but as a way for this poor, desperate girl to survive, to make a living. Or the Puerto Rican anarchist Luisa Capetillo's short story, Como se prostituyen los pobres, how the poor prostitute are prostituted, in which one of the characters is a prostitute and a reformer says, why don't you get a job? And the prostitute says, you're advising me to earn a miserable wage, breathe impure air, and have to hear the insults from some rude foreman. Prostitution gave her more freedom, more autonomy. Revolutionary women is what some of these women are in anarchist culture. For instance, in Lewis Bernard's La Vida, you get Lisi, who hates suffragists, these women who are pushing for the right to vote. She wants a revolution because only when women are running the world will they melt down all the bayonets and the swords into plowshares and trains and implements, right? As she writes, I'm an outrageous revolutionary. I consider myself an anarchist like Luis Michel from the Aristocracy. Or the Puerto Rican writer Enrique Plaza's Futuro, in which the main character Rosa is actually modeled after a young female school teacher in this anarchist school in the small city of Caguas in Puerto Rico. Or again, in Puerto Rico, Jesus Santiago's story El Día Triunfante, in which Maria and Elisa are in a conversation. And Maria talks about anarchy and anarchy, Jesus, what horror, isn't that criminal, Maria, says Elisa. And Maria's like, no, it's socialism, but it's a different socialism. It's a more radical form of socialism. That's what I'm for. And finally, you get Adrian De Valle's very famous play written in 1898, performed in Cuba and Puerto Rico, throughout South America, in the United States, in which the heroine is Elena. Her father owns a factory. Her boyfriend is the leader of the strike against her father's factory. Her father comes to shoot the strike leader, her boyfriend, and just as dad is pulling the trigger, Elena jumps in front of her lover and takes the bullet. Melodrama, yes, but you see the picture, these sort of revolutionary heroines. A revolutionary heroism that translates into a form of revolutionary motherhood. These are, many of you might know this image from the left. This is a very famous illustration from the Nicaraguan Revolution that was circulating in the early 1980s of the young Sandinista mother nursing her child with the AK-47 strapped over her shoulder. It's very reflective of another image on the right that you saw in anarchist newspapers around the world, again, of woman as shining the light. Okay, she's sort of this mother nature figure. Well, this notion of revolutionary motherhood comes through in the real life. Luisa Capetillo, who from Puerto Rico, who had a child but continued to be an activist. Or in the Cuban writer Adrian De Valle's short story in El Mar, in which There's a shipwreck, people are in this lifeboat, there's a little baby, and this rich count is dying of starvation. He wants to eat the child. And so the heroine of the story knocks him over the head, throws him into the shark-infested waters, takes up the crying baby, and bears her milkless nipple in order to suckle the poor child, this sort of revolutionary motherhood. Or La Mulata Soledad, I referenced a little bit ago about race, in which the heroine, again, Soledad, is raised by anarchists and convinces her lover to be an anarchist. Free love becomes key here as well. Take Luisa Capetillo's In El Campo, Amor Libre, in the countryside, free love, in which she talks about the character Aurora, who doesn't want to get married because she doesn't want her intelligence to be stunted, because she thinks marriage will stunt it. And she's telling this to her boyfriend, Victor, and Victor agrees. He says, you are completely free to do whatever pleases you. So this strong revolutionary woman who wants to have this free union, this free love relationship, which ties into motherhood too. In Capetillo's probably most famous work, Influences of Modern Ideas, Angelina falls in love with a strike leader named Carlos. They want to enter into a free union. And she turns to the audience at the end of the story and says, if you want to be mothers of conscientious generations and to be free, don't make contracts at the civil registry, nor in temples, because that is a sale, and the sale is prostitution. Free love. Finally, talking about women, De Valle had a lot of these stories were published in the late 1920s. A lot of his stuff that I'm talking about today were published in the late 1920s. When the late 1920s, Cuban anarchism was on the ropes. Gerardo Machado was dictator in Cuba, and he was leveling this massive repression against the entire political left, Marxists and anarchists. And so what I would argue is not only in these stories is he portraying these women as these revolutionary mothers, but I think in many ways they are an homage and an honoring of the very real women who were living in Cuba in the 1920s when he wrote these, whose partners are being arrested, whose male partners are being deported, who are being sent into exile, or who are being murdered by the dictatorship. So another way of gender coming through here. Two brief final things, and I'll finish here. Abortion comes through in anarchist culture, but not very often. And in anarchist culture, it's always looked down upon. For instance, in Antonio Pinochet's Alma Rebelde, Rosa's the strong-willed woman, her son gets his girlfriend pregnant, and they contemplate an abortion. Rosa says no. And Miguel, the lead character, agrees, saying the child ought to be preserved, for nobody knows what its designated mission is on the earth. It seemed to be an abomination to destroy the child brought forth from a woman's vital organs. A strong anti-abortion component in this. And homosexuality, not discussed very often, but actually, when it is discussed, it's not in any progressive way. Take Pinochet's La Vida de un Pernicioso, in which you get Joaquin, who's this labor union leader, a hero in the story. His arch nemesis is the conservative newspaper publisher, Lores, who is described this way by Pinochet. Lores lived with another man, and in that bed, on that mat, on that sofa, he celebrated repugnant and scandalous orgies. Homosexuality was a tool by which to attack one's bourgeois opponents as degenerates from an anarchist point of view. So in conclusion, what I argue is that all of this culture has a larger purpose. It's to help create this anarchist identity throughout the region, done through the press, done through migration, but culture plays a big role. The performing of plays, the writing about global events, the shipping of this literature all around the region. So everybody has a sort of shared cultural experience that is done to promote ways to live in the present while also envisioning the future. And I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Kirk, for that really interesting and exciting talk. Let's move to, next we have Montse Feu, who is an associate professor of Hispanic Studies at Sam Houston State University. Feu recovers and examines the literary history of the Spanish Civil War exile in the United States, US Hispanic periodicals, and migration and exile literature at large. She is the author of Correspondencia Personal y Política de un Anarcosindicalista Exiliado, Jesus González Malo, and Fighting Fascist Spain, Worker Protest from the Printing Press. She is co-editor of Writing Revolution, Hispanic Anarchism in the United States. Her talk is titled Women Fighting Fascist Spain, Protest and Solidarity in the United States. So thank you again, Montse, and take it away.
Thank you, Spencer, for your introduction, for inviting us and for organizing this. And thank you everyone who joined us. With my talk, we are moving to New York, to the United States, but mainly New York. And my talk about anarchist culture is gonna be very narrow about the anti-fascist fight. There will also be some socialist and communist women because they were working in this coalition, the Sociedades Hispanas Confederadas. So this summer, I'm working on this project. It's a digital project where I have all these exhibits, and I'm very fortunate to doing that. So this is a work in progress with many gaps still. So it's gonna be wonderful if you can give me your feedback. I'm very lucky to have the support of Arte Público Press digital collection. So that's where you will be able to access them. I have a very easy access through my webpage, Montse Feu Wix site. So you can link there and go to the exhibitions as we populate them. I'm also this summer have the FAST Award from my university. So I have some undergraduate students helping me. They are here today. Hi, Diego. I see Bailey's there too. So they are really helping me putting all this together. So there are other wonderful exhibitions in the Arte Público Press collections, especially one that is being done by Dr. Ana Maria Diaz Marcos. She has worked on periodical La Voz, and she recovers a lot of anti-feminist texts. So that's very important, that recovery. So please check that out too. So another thing I want to mention before I start is that a lot of the archives, periodicals, letters, as Kirk was saying, plays, workers, radical workers, anarchists, put a lot of attention in preserving them. Unfortunately, a lot is lost because their locales, you know, their headquarters were raided by the FBI. They were lost for not having enough funds, for lack of institutional interest. So sometimes what I found is not exactly what it was. So we need to acknowledge that I may be misrepresenting the subjects I talk about because I don't have all the information. I just have what it remained. And with women, these gaps is even more acute. So they leave the patriarchal exile from the Spanish Civil War, but also the United States context. But despite this patriarchal context, they were very active, effective activists. They can, gender, race was kind of put aside because the focus was fighting fascism. So I've been trying to find material about this revolutionary motherhood that Kirk was talking about, but basically the strategy was the same as in France and in Mexico, other big, and Venezuela, other big places of exile, is the motherhood, the more domesticated revolutionaries, right? The ones who take care of the children and the home. So no wonder that in the periodicals I researched the most, Frente Popular and España Libre, they are portrayed as the fundraisers. So women would sell tickets, perform, make costumes, make food, organize dances, so they would fundraise for the cause. Here they are called puntales, so that means they are the pillars of the sociedades. So without them, without the funds, nothing happens. So that's why the The intellectual persona is harder to find. I'm not saying it didn't exist, maybe it has been lost, but it's much, much harder to find. First, because of the patriarchal exile, but also they were being watched by the government here in the United States, and also for the pro-Franco diplomacy and agents. So sometimes they were very cautious to protect family in Spain, family in the United States, and also the periodicals themselves. They wanted to continue publishing. So they were very cautious on publishing. Maybe the most well-known is Fredericka Munsen, and her papers were published from the 1920s in many, many periodicals here in the United States. Via Libre, Cultura Proletaria, Boletín del Torcedor. We have many, many of her writings. During 1937, when she was the Republican Minister of Health and Social Policy, she sent several calls of action. Especially, she wanted ambulances and condensed milk. So the first call was published in May 1 in Frente Popular, and within a year, the Sociedades sent 8 ambulances to Spain. So women were doing very hard work to get all that sent to Spain, as well with condensed milk and everything else that was needed. She was invited again in another talk in Madison Square Garden. This was done by radio from Spain. She talked along La Pasionaria and very other notable, as you can see, personalities of the time. And again, these were calls for action and help to save Spain from fascism. During the 1940s, well, let me just go back. During the 1940s, the Sociedades invited Montseny again, but this time in person. This, to me, was a graceful attempt to get her out of the Nazi occupation of France. They did that also with Largo Caballero. So not to insult her, they invited her to an event, but she said she was unable to travel because she was needed in France. Her articles on anarchism, but also on labor issues, not so much on gender issues at all, continued to be published in French and España Libre until the 1960s. This is one in 1963, yeah. So here she talks about the need to continue the fight against fascism. She says that anti-fascists died 1,000 deaths. And she thinks that is because they saw their friends, their children, their women, their mothers die. So they died, those 100 sorrows, worse than death itself, to then die themselves. Here again, the focus is the man usually. And she asked readers in the United States to continue that sacrifice and continue fighting for freedom in the 60s. The ideal, the trust in men, here notice the patriarchal language, the hope for tomorrow. That's what Kirk was talking about, this hope for a better future, was sustain them to that death in Spain, and it should sustain us to continue fight that we cannot stop, and we need to succeed in this cause. During the Spanish Civil War and after, prominent Spanish women politicians were invited to speak either by radio or invited in the United States in the rallies. Here we have Margarita Nelken. She was a socialist politician, feminist, and writer. She was invited in the Centro Galicia in New York in 1938. The Sociedades printed 3,000 flyers announcing her visit and paid radio announcements to promote the event. So they were expecting to do a huge fund collection of funds and calls of action. Her speech is quoted in La Voz, but again, it's quoted only when she talks about male generals and what they are suffering in Spain. Nelken was invited again the following year in the Manhattan Center in New York, and also it talks about supporting victims. This is usually what women were addressed as, to support victims. So in 1939, in November, Frente Popular changed to España Libre because there was this communist members were asked to leave because they were following party guidelines. But before they were asked to leave, some communist women were very, very active. Two of them I'm trying to trace is Ernestina Gonzalez, you see her here, and Carmen Meana. They were organizers and speakers on many events. In 1937, Ernestina talked from Spain. She was a librarian then in Madrid, and her call was transmitted in a rally in Webster Hall, New York. There were other very famous anarchists like Serafina Aliaga, Juan López, Ralph Bates. Her speech, Mujeres a la Lucha, in another event in Royal Windsor, who asked women to fight fascism, has been published in this collection that I mentioned before. And this is actually talks about gender, which I was like, finally, right? She says how fascism will attack the civil rights of women. So that's why women had to fight it. So you can find it in the collections. So after the Spanish Civil War, the Franco regime started proceedings against Ernestina and her sister, Maria Luisa. Maria Luisa went to Russia and Gonzalez came to the United States. When the separation of the communists, she moved to the periodical Liberación and became executive member of the Refugee Relief Committee. And in November 1950, Ernestina and Helen Bryan were in prison for 3 months and had to pay $500 because they refused to provide the records of this committee to the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And this I lose trace of her. So I'm looking for more information. And the same happens with Meana. She was a journalist in Spain. She came to the United States with Ramon J. Sender in a tour for calls for action to help Spain against fascism. She spoke with Ramon J. Sender in front of 22,000 attendees because the Confederadas made national congresses. But again, I don't have her speech. So I have these speeches of them are lost, or at least I cannot find them. She became a common speaker in all the Confederadas rallies and national congresses. But then again, when they separated, she moved to Liberación, and she did the same, but this time with Puerto Rican leader Jesus Colón, the communist Puerto Rican Jesus Colón. And I guess it was more about gender and race there, I hope. And yeah, she became a writer and business manager for Liberación. I know she left to Cuba in 1953. So we have Palencia, here we have Palencia speaking, you know, all these famous diplomats and feminists from Spain were invited. Also, the daughter of Francisco Ferrer was invited, but this is in 1952. So this doesn't stop with the Spanish Civil War, as it is believed. It continues until democracy is back in Spain. So she's invited, she talks about her father. She says how she likes that the periodicals here in the United States, the Spanish periodicals, continue to promote her father's work. Another woman I worked about is Aldecoa. She published this book about all the anarchist publications in Spain before the Spanish Civil War and how these were being destroyed. But then she also made sure to recognize Millie Whitcup, the Jewish anarcho-syndicalist, feminist writer and activist and companion of Rudolf Roca. She published this in España Libre, but not in New York, in France. She was working as an adjunct in New York University. So I think she was very cautious to publish here in the United States. And in the article, is in the front page, it starts really, you know, in the patriarchal way of she's the companion on Rudolf Roca, but at the inside of the periodical was this much smaller article. The tone changes dramatically and says that actually it's Millie who has created Rodolfo Rocker. Rudolf Roca. So with these sentences at the very most, Aldecoa attempts to acknowledge that this paper woman and political thinker actually wrote with Roca and helped Roca a lot. Also, Aldecoa worked very close with Nancy MacDonald, another anarchist that created the Spanish refugee aid that saved a lot of refugees in France. Both wrote books about the efforts and giving voices to these silenced victims of fascism. Women were extraordinary organizing, and they demonstrated. Here we have pictures of 2,500 women demonstrating in the front of the House of Representatives in Washington against the arms embargo during the Spanish Civil War, and also constantly demonstrated in front of the consulates, of Britain, France, Spain. The last one, do I have time? How much do I have? Not much time, right?
Give a few minutes, you're good.
Yeah, so what I'm working on is another anarchist that maybe I can talk in another talk because I think I went over. So what I want to say is that if we want to create historical justice, is imperative that dismantle elitism in academia and try to recover these voices that sometimes is only gaps that we can show. So sometimes digital humanities projects will help us show these gaps that we have, these inconsistencies that we know they rallied, but we don't know their voices. Another anarchist I was going to talk about is Mikelli, Joletta Mikelli. There is more of her. Is more printed about her. But today I wanted to focus on the gaps, to acknowledge that what we say is not exactly what it might happen just because we didn't keep those voices.
All right, thank you so much, Montse. And my partner's in the same house as me right now, and she's on this call, and I heard her clapping from the other room, so. All right, so I'm the last presenter. Gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. All right, so my name is Spencer Beswick. As I said before, I'm a PhD candidate in history at Cornell University. I'm writing my dissertation on anarchism in the late 20th century. And I have a chapter coming out in an edited collection on anarchism and punk. It's being published by Active Distribution. Should be next year, but that's what this talk is based off of. So if you're interested, you should check that out. Okay, so my talk has the grandiose title of Smashing Whiteness, Race, Class, and Punk Culture in the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Federation. So I start with this picture of an anti-fascist demonstration. So this comes off very well from Montse's talk. This is in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1993. The Ku Klux Klan had planned a rally. Anarchists showed up first, took it over, and the Klan quietly went home to avoid a confrontation. And Love and Rage was very involved with this. Alongside anti-racist action, and they worked very closely together. But my talk is not on anti-fascism, so I just wanted to make that connection. But what I really want to begin with is an all too familiar phenomenon on the left that I think some of us have probably experienced, right? Of a mostly white anarchist group reflecting on the problem of its own whiteness. So in the mid-1990s, debates about whiteness, about punk culture, and about revolutionary strategy and how these three things work together erupted in the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Federation, which was formed in 1989, dissolved in 1998, and was really the lodestone of the US anarchist movement in the 1990s. In an editorial published by one faction of the group in 1997, they argue that, quote, "Our biggest obstacle is that love and rage is still culturally very white. Smashing this culture of whiteness is a major task in becoming the kind of truly inclusive organization we are committed to building, end quote. What does it mean to smash a culture of whiteness? And for that matter, what do they even mean by a culture of whiteness? Or to pose another question, which I think is still very relevant for us today, how can anarchists practice effective anti-racist politics? And how is this connected to anarchist cultures of resistance? And I think that we have much to learn from the experience and the history of Love and Rage and their grappling with these questions. And so that's what my talk today is going to be about. So let's jump right in to talk about the context from which Love and Rage arose in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, we know that the radical movements of the 60s had largely dissolved or had been violently repressed by the state. The left was relatively fragmented, mostly dominated by single issue campaigns, and often just fighting to maintain any of the social advances and radical gains of the 1960s against the Reagan counter-revolution. But while the state-oriented left and the new left writ large was in disarray, anarchism was actually on the rise. And I think that the 1980s were actually the key decade in the rebirth of anarchism at the end of the 20th century that later became apparent in the anti-globalization movement at the turn of the 21st century. But for most of the 1980s, the anarchist movement was decentralized and relatively uncoordinated. Anarchists participated in ecological movements, anti-nuclear movements, feminist and anti-racist struggles, and the Central America solidarity movements. But through their participation in these different movements, many of them began to see the need for greater national coordination between local anarchist groups. And they especially saw this because of butting heads with the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was very active in especially the Central American Solidarity movement and the radical coalitions around that, and was able to exercise an outside influence because of their national coordination. So the anarchists said, we need something that enables us to coordinate nationally and to exercise a united anarchist front to compete with the other forces that are active in these movements. Of course, they don't want to be like how the Revolutionary Communist Party is doing it. But in 1986, a nationwide anarchist convergence was held in Chicago to mark the 100-year anniversary of the Haymarket Affair. And this led to a series of annual convergences in Minneapolis, in Toronto, and in San Francisco that helped to coordinate the loose anarchist movements across the continent. And in 1989, some of the most pro-organization participants in these growing continental networks started a newspaper called Love and Rage, which became a network to coordinate local anarchist groups, and then in the early 1990s voted to become a membership-based federation, with chapters across the United States, a couple chapters in Canada, and one in Mexico City, which would later work closely with the Zapatistas in Chiapas and be one of the main conduits of news and interviews and such with the Zapatistas to the US anarchist and radical left, which is a story for another day, but is super interesting history. And as I said before, the Love and Rage Federation became arguably the most important element in the anarchist movement in these years, and it has had a lasting impact on anarchism and on the left more broadly in the US and beyond. So Love and Rage defined itself as a revolutionary anarchist organization with key touch points both in classical anarchist theory, but also in more recent anti-racist, feminist, and anti-imperialist theory and practice. They said that we need to adapt and reconsider anarchism to have it address the problems of late 20th century capitalism, white supremacy, state violence in the United States. And the revolutionary strategy was based in building dual power structures that would both attack the state and capitalism and at the same time provide radical alternatives to them. So to use one example, which I'll come back to a couple times throughout this, we can think of something like cop watch programs as part of an anti-police program, and that these programs attempt to prevent the police from exercising state power and state violence, and so to constrain the ability of the state to enact its violence, while at the same time working to provide alternative structures of community defense that can build power from the ground up. So it's these kinds of programs, these kinds of new radical structures that Love and Rage saw as the necessary first step towards building revolution in the United States. But one of the great innovations of Love and Rage, beyond just updating anarchism for the new era, was to reject the dominant orientation of anarchism towards race in US history, which was one that was mainly colorblind, right? Of a sort of universalist impulse to say, of course, all people are equal, of course, racism is bad, but to not have any kind of specific program to address white supremacy in the United States, or often not have any specific program. Of course, some did, right? The anarchist influenced Industrial Workers of the World was one of the first major unions to organize across color lines and definitely thought a lot about this. But on the main, the dominant tendency was towards a kind of colorblindness. And so Love and Rage saw white supremacy as one of the main barriers to revolution in the United States, and they dedicated themselves to anti-racist politics. And they thought that the only way to effectively organize for revolutionary change was to address racism head on. They were, of course, not the first people in the United States to do this, right? And they were greatly inspired by earlier generations, both of white anti-racists and anti-imperialists, as well as contemporary Black anarchists in the 1980s, like Ashanti Alston, Lorenzo Kumboa Ervin, and other ex-Black Panthers who theorized a new form of Black anarchism or new African anarchism while they were imprisoned for revolutionary activity in the 1970s and 80s. And Lorenzo Kumboa Ervin was a member of Love and Rage for a few years before breaking from the organization, accusing them of not handling racial politics well. So despite Love and Rage's commitment to anti-racism, they were overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly punk. They were largely the white children of the middle class, what co-founder Chris Day called re-proletarians. So downwardly mobile middle-class youth who were becoming more precarious and more proletarian because of the economic changes of neoliberalism. And the particular class and race experience of Love and Rage's social base led to a specific form of what political theorist A.K. Thompson has called ontological politics. So a politics of being, and so an ontological political orientation sought a new way of being in the world, a new way of living, a new way of relating to each other, rather than solely focusing on trying to change the mode of production and to seize the means of production. So it entailed a total rejection of the mainstream world and a commitment to radically reshaping everyday life. And this form of politics was particularly appealing to the children of the white middle class because of their experience growing up within the empty alienation of white middle class life and their lack of readily accessible traditions of resistance to draw upon. And they came to anarchism mostly through the punk scene rather than through workplace organizing, because the factory base for the left was mostly gone. They were working precarious service jobs, and so they found an alternative world and an alternative home and orientation for life in the punk scene. So punk offered an intertwined radical lifestyle and politics that appealed to this ontological orientation. And so subcultural identity was a way to live one's politics as a total break from the prevailing order. And as many people have argued before me, punk was in many ways inherently anarchist, right? Not that all punks were anarchist, of course. Love and Rage was fighting neo-Nazi punks in the streets and defending punk bars from them. But punk's DIY ethics and practices, its rejection of hierarchies and oppressions, and of course the open anarchist politics espoused by many bands in the scene, together constituted the possible base for what cultural theorist Jesse Cohn terms an anarchist resistance culture. But even though punk provided this home for anarchism and sort of kept anarchism alive in the 1970s and early 80s and in counter-revolutionary era, it was also very, very white, with key exceptions that we know, like Bad Brains, Los Crudos, but for both historical reasons, around the rise of punk in the UK in the 70s, and also ongoing problems of racism within punk scenes, it remained relatively white throughout the 1980s and 90s. But the key point here is that punk provided a basis for a new radical way of being for these white children of the middle class, and that this provided the context and the basis for the entire existence of Love and Rage, whether or not this was consciously understood or embraced. So we have Love and Rage, an anarchist federation that sought to build revolutionary dual power, but was intimately tied to the white punk subcultural milieu. And these subcultural affinities made it very difficult for the Federation to expand beyond its white base or to work in coalition with people of color. So how then, for these white punks in Love and Rage who are committed to anti-racism, how were they to practice effective anti-racist politics without abandoning the cultural commitments of the membership? So here's where a new element comes in, which is the idea of race trader politics. So the slogan of the Race Trader Journal, which is where race trader politics were really developed, was that treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. So key race trader theorists like Noel Ignatieff, who's a longtime communist anti-racist militant, argued that the main barrier to revolution in the United States is that white workers identify more with their race than with their class. Oh wait, and race traders called for the abolition of the white race as a social category in order to enable multiracial working class rebellion. And Ignatieff developed this theory while he was in the Sojourner Truth organization, which was a new left formation that worked in factories trying to really build anti-racist radical working class institutions and direct struggle at the points of production. And so he really theorized this in the context of thinking about how to unite white and black workers. And so he says that the first step in the dissolution of whiteness as a social category would be to engage in race trader acts. So race trader acts were meant to materially break away from the white club that maintained white supremacy and force people and institutions to treat the race trader differently than they would a, quote, normal white person. So for Ignatieff, this could mean everything from talking back to cops, to listening to hip hop, to getting dreadlocks. And although we might identify the latter as problematic, right, and say, okay, what is the revolutionary potential of white people listening to hip hop? Race traders believed that if enough white people began to act in these traitorous ways, it would destabilize the dominant position of whiteness, because the institutions and people that maintain white supremacy would no longer be able to look at a person with white skin and say, I can count on this person to act as a white person, to act in a way that will maintain the hierarchies that maintain white supremacy in the United States. And Ignatieff saw this both as an individual and as a collective project, right? It was individual race trader acts, but also collective ones, especially in the workplace, right? To have solidarity with workers of color and to attack the racist institutions at work. And this position was taken up by many in Love and Rage, and Ignatieff was a member of Love and Rage, but with a punk inflection, right? So many punks in the 1990s embraced race trader politics. And they cultivated the punk aesthetic very consciously as a way to mark punks as different from the mainstream white middle-class world, as outside the bounds of normal whiteness. So the aesthetic identification with rebellious punk culture through dress, through the norms of the music, through the way that you interact with authority figures, all of this was meant to force these people and institutions that maintain white supremacy, especially your boss, cops, teachers, to treat white punks differently. And so these white punks thought that this would help to break down the social identification of whiteness and thus contribute to its dissolution. But how does this play out in Love and Rage? there's some major potential problems with this approach that I would identify. And the first is, I'm running out of time, so I'll say that I see two major ways that this played out, or that one could practice race traitor politics. The first is this kind of individual aesthetic rebellion, right? That is very performative and that is based on an individual rejection of the white world. But the problem with these is that it became clear that they didn't necessarily actually materially challenge the structures and institutions of white supremacy. Dressing like a punk might shock other white people, the normal white people, but it didn't actually break down the police departments, right? Or cause schools to not function anymore because they can't identify white students as white people. But it's the punk inflection that kind of pushes this individual performative aesthetic action versus what Ignatieff saw as a more collective action against white supremacy that would materially challenge its institutions and build a new world. So materially challenge police, schools, capitalist businesses, etc. Right, and this tension played out within Love and Rage in debates over political strategies in the 1990s. And one of the major disagreements was about focusing on anti-police work and promoting cop watch programs, which Ignatieff saw as the right kind of race traitor politics that would both challenge the institutions that maintain white supremacy, especially the police, and build up potential alternatives, building power from below to create community defense programs. Right, but this political orientation was rejected by Love and Rage to focus more on internal subcultural organizing that was meant mostly to organize other children of the white middle class rather than create coalitions with people of color, with workers, and to build power from below. And that the lesson to draw from this, I conclude, is that of course it was right for Love and Rage to center white supremacy and the need for concerted anti-racist action, but it too often got sucked into this kind of moralistic, individualistic, aesthetic approach to challenging white supremacy. And that the lesson for us to take away from it is that we really need to focus on collective political action. We don't need to abandon punk subculture. I'm not telling people to, stop dressing like punks. I exist in this world, right? But rather to acknowledge that we need to help build broad-based cultures of resistance and revolutionary dual power that cross these subcultural boundaries and organize with other people to bring down the institutions of white supremacy, the state, and capitalism. So I'll end there. Thank you again so much. Sorry that I went a few minutes over time. I'll stop sharing my screen. All right. Here we are. Okay, so we have about a half hour left. So if folks have questions, please go ahead and indicate in the chat that you want to get on Stack, and I'll call on you and you can unmute and say your question out loud. Or if you would just want to write a question in the chat, I can read it out for you. Yeah, Kenyon, go ahead.
Hello, thank you all for those great talks. So Spencer, my question is for you actually. Right, so you sort of at the beginning sketched this very colorblind version of American anarchist history, which I would suggest is a little less complicated than things actually were, right? It really depends on which anarchists, where, and when you're talking about, because you had Chinese anarchist groups, Japanese anarchist groups, Mexican and Latinx anarchist groups, who very much were concerned with racialization as it pertained to them, even groups of European immigrants who were racialized in different ways, right? So it is true that, anti-Blackness was usually not centered, and parallel to that, there's not really any evidence that I know of Black anarchist groups in sort of the anarchist left in the classical period. But, right, not all race is about whiteness and blackness, and right, so it's just a bit of a critique of that sort of oversimplified picture of what historical anarchism in the United States looked like.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kenyon. I totally agree, and I glossed over it more than I should have, because I do think it is more complicated than I portrayed it. I do think that still that the dominant orientation was more colorblind, but yeah, as you said, there's a variety of different groups. There's in a whole alternative history that we can trace, right, of Chinese anarchists, of anarchists along the Mexican border, who are working with the IWW and Ricardo Flores Magon's Mexican Liberal Party. There's also, I just a few weeks ago read this amazing article about this black cooperative group that was promoting workplace cooperatives in the 1930s that Ella Baker helped to run. And it was, the other co-founder was an anarchist, and Ella Baker taught Peter Kropotkin's mutual aid in classes on workplace cooperatives that she taught in the 1930s, which is fantastic. But all that is to say, yes, I appreciate your critique, and that perhaps what is more important is that in the late 20th century, people, like, the common sense of anarchism and of anarchist history is that it's white. So this is kind of the milieu, the cultural norms that people are engaging with. And yeah, I don't want to reproduce that in my own work. So I appreciate the intervention.
Right, and Andy Cornell has uncovered a lot of sort of unacknowledged anarchist participation, sort of mid-century like organizations like CORE, right, and the Freedom Rides and stuff, which may be in part a prehistory, because there is going to be some overlap. People like Murray Bookchin and whatnot, which might be, there might be a little bit more immediate prehistory to the what you're talking about with Love and Rage that just hasn't really been excavated.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'm looking at the chat. Laura Marie had a question for Kirk. I don't know if you want to unmute and say the question yourself, or if you want me to read it out.
Oh, I can just address. I think everybody can see the question. So the question essentially is, I'm looking at these Caribbean short stories and novels, particularly the books. How long were they? It depended. Some, like the novels by Antonio Pinochet in the late 19 teens in Cuba, were serious, almost 200-page novels. They're formally bound in leather, published in established printing presses there in Havana. A lot of them, particularly these shorter pieces, particularly the works by Adrian De Valle, were about 30 pages long. It was part of a series that was published in Barcelona called the La Novela Ideal series. And these were very short novellas written by anarchists from around the Spanish-speaking world. The first person to have a story published in this series was actually De Valle, this Cuban anarchist. Now, were they propaganda or soul-nourishing art? I like the adjective there. Most of them are propagandistic. They're meant to be a quick read. They're meant to be the sort of short educational bursts. They're meant to try to showcase a critique of their present or a potentiality of what could be. And yet there were others, and that I didn't talk about because I'm really stopping in the 20s. But in the 20s and 30s and early 40s, there's another Cuban anarchist who becomes very influential. His name is Marcelo Salinas. I'm writing a biography of him right now, and he published a play in 1928 called Alma Guajira, the soul of the Cuban peasant, and this play won a national literary competition, and it was actually turned into a movie, a silent film, and it may very well have been the first silent film based on an anarchist publication in Latin America, written by an anarchist in Latin America. This was in 1929 when it hit celluloid. But he would go on and become a literary figure who would continue to win prizes for his plays, his short stories, and became quite instrumental as a literary figure, again, mainly in the 1930s and early 1940s. So some soul-nourishing art as well as a little bit of propaganda too.
All right, next on stack, we have Mikey Bakunin.
Hi, I have a question for Kirwin. This is perhaps a bit outside the temporal range of your study, but I'm curious, as Castro took power in Cuba, I recently read Frank Fernandez's excellent book on Cuban anarchism, and particularly at the end, there's no real optimistic way to end a book like that. As anarchist formal organizations were being cracked down, I'm curious if there was a lag in terms of anarchist popular literature, especially when it comes to fiction, which can be a bit more allegorical. Usually it takes a bit longer, under state Communist Party-led regimes to crack down on that. I'm curious if you have a sense that was perhaps sort of the last anarchist pin to fall, or was it perhaps the other way around?
So I'm writing not only this biography of Marcelo Salinas, but also another piece on the history of anarchism in Cuba in the late 50s, early 1960s, as I mentioned. And I'm not finding much culture, much fiction at all. Not even in the publications that they're putting out. Maybe in 1950, they've got this little magazine called Estudios Mensuario de Cultura, which is a short little, it's actually a pretty long magazine, maybe about 50 pages each issue, full of all kinds of literary stuff, some stories, but not a strong anarchist cultural presence in terms of fiction. And even by the late 1950s, even into the first 2 years of the revolution, 59, 60, and then 61, they're crushed by the state. There's really no literary works that are being published by anarchists. Now, Salinas is still around. He will eventually go into exile into Miami in 1967. And it looks like he wrote a couple of plays, but nothing seems to have ever been published. But nevertheless, he was recognized in exile for this great literary career, even into the 1970s. But it really kind of stopped. This great anarchist literary boom really peaks, as far as I can tell so far, in the early 1940s. Montse may have something to that.
Well, just very little. What I've noticed with the group I studied, because of the watch and the state watch and all that, we also have, for example, the one that I published about Felix Martí Ibáñez. He changes his short stories and novels, and obviously he doesn't call them anarchists because he's a professor at NYU, but it's the same. If you read through the stories, is anarchist propaganda all right? Because he, like the one story I mentioned in one of the articles, is all this performative, this future that changes, this ability to dream at any moment. And they go to the Galapagos, where is this, obviously the sense of competitiveness, and instead the characters is because it's where Darwin created the theory, right? And then it's where all these characters that had nothing in common start cooperating and sharing dreams. You're telling me that's not anarchism, right? But they couldn't call it this. So he sells it as this fantastic story. And then we have all these other writers that have created. So that's why literature was very important, not just as propaganda, but this was because literary thinking and humor, especially humor, was very important too, makes you envision what it's not. So it's a way to contrast what is and what is not. And sometimes it was not labeled like this to avoid being censored, but that doesn't mean that the thought continued.
All right, next on stack, we have David Struthers.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the talks. Spencer, I'm going to have to go dig through my old bins at my parents' house looking for some 90s punk scenes now. My question is for Montse and Kirk. So, something we've all talked about, and many of the people in the audience, we've all worked with anarchist newspapers in the early 20th century. I think it's relatively straightforward to be able to trace lines of distribution, publishing, because of how those papers were organized. But I wanted to ask you how this worked in the novels, in the more kind of like fictional representations of that were coming out of these movements. So how are they being published? How are they being distributed? And something that I've spent time in my own work is like the readership. Is like, how are they being read, for what purpose, when, by who, all those kind of practical things. So thanks.
Go ahead, Montse.
You want me to start?
Go
Well,
ahead.
in the case I'm researching, they were always in their locales, in their headquarters. They had this library where they were distributing these books. A lot of the writers donated these books. They had print shops. A lot of anarchists were in contact with print shops, and a lot of these books were printed and sold very cheaply, so that is this focus on education. And they were sent by mail. They were distributed by mail, and there were ads on the periodicals. So we have these 30 volumes from Pinochet have arrived. It's with as Simmer, Kenyon said in another, it's like Facebook or their time, right? The first 30 got the books, and then these books were shared. So it was certainly a network of sharing these books on their papers, but also on their letters. So the letters also would let them know, look, whoever sent us this book, if you want them, we can share it to your, and so it was this distribution among their networks and publications.
For the Caribbean fiction, it's the same. It's the same. Now, the La Novela Ideal series, a series is published in Barcelona, of which De Valle was a writer for. That has a global distribution. It goes to Spanish-speaking anarchists throughout Europe, the United States, and Latin America. And I pick up on what Montse just said too, the mail order. The mail order was big. And I'd add one other thing. Some of these things, some of these pieces, particularly shorter pieces, were sometimes serialized in newspapers. And so, for instance, in the cigar rolling factories, you had this phenomenon called the lector, or the reader, who was chosen by the cigar rollers, and the reader, and they would pick what the reader would read. And sometimes the reader would, in fact, read these short stories as they're being serialized, or even just from the books themselves.
And another very important thing about these short stories serialized is what helps sell these newspapers sometimes, because obviously these newspapers address the political action, but then address other needs, like reading at home at night that was cheap, cheap to buy, ways of learning to read, because a lot of these workers needed, so periodicals were a way for the family to teach this reading, the mom to the kids and things like that. So it was another way that make the periodical have subscribers.
All right, thank you both. Next on stack, we have Lil O.A. Interested in the presenter's thoughts on a time-related idea. I don't know if you want to explain further.
Yeah, for sure. So it kind of came to me with sort of starting out the various presentations with the idea of like, prefigurative politics and the pulling of the future into the present as like a part of the, liberatory project. And thinking about how that relationship can maybe also be done in terms of the past. So looking at, say, with Montse, with both acknowledging the gaps in history, but then also the way in which, like, at the time, there was the attempt at preservation and state intervention, but then, like, the current project of trying to reconstruct as much as possible. And then also with the idea of, like, the punk rock subculture being kids who didn't feel like they had access to a tradition of liberation, and maybe the idea of, like, race traitorism as the construction of a tradition of, like, a new past. And so, like, what's the way in which we can sort of pull the past into the present as well? Because, like, assuming that the project doesn't stop with us at this time, like not just how can we pull from it, but like how can we be constructing the present as a past, which is a fulfillable project or a redeemable moment in time. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. That's why I keep focusing more and more on recovery work and working on primary sources, which in the elitism of academia is not so well regarded, but I see all these primary sources sometimes not easily available, and I just don't care. I need this needs to be preserved. And these were actually, as you said very well, during the Spanish Civil War was the help to refugees, but after the Spanish Civil War was this focus on preserving, because they knew they were being destroyed in Spain and also in the United States. They not always had the possibility to preserve. And that's why some of them left their archives here in the United States. They didn't give them back to Spain because they didn't trust Spain. And they also focus on the future. So that they focus more on this revolutionary idea that it can happen every day. So being more open to listening to others and focus with the liberties that they had here in the United States, even though they didn't think they were enough, but they kind of created this new ethnic identity that focus in the future here in the United States and working from the United States with Spain and Latin America and other anarchists. So there was a lot of cooperation with all sorts of people, and this hunger to learn, this thirst to learn from other people that you don't see during the Spanish War or before. Sometimes is there are a lot of boundaries about who is who. I've noticed a change, trying to make a future that is less, yeah, sorry, sometimes I get stuck with words.
I would just say really quick, and I don't know how much this is an answer to your question, but I think one of the great examples for me that comes to mind of anarchist practice that is connecting past, present, and future is the Interference Archive in Brooklyn, which I'm going to be spending the fall at, doing research and volunteering, right? But an archive that is open to the public, that runs events, that has exhibitions, and that really connects past social movement practice with contemporary action, and also, helps to build the future. So I think that kind of thing is a really great example for me.
And let me just very quickly say, in Cuba, there's a relatively recently created anarchist organization in Cuba, the first in almost 50 years. And one of the important figures in it is a university professor who goes by the nom de guerre of Marcelo Salinas, this guy from the 20s to the 60s that I've been writing about. So bringing that past into his modern Cuban present.
That's great. All right, the next question in the chat is from Andrew Harding to me. It's about, did Love and Rage reach out to form networks with anarchist groups from other countries? Was it nationally limited? What was their thinking on racialized social relations? Was that limited to the US context? So they had a chapter in Mexico City, and so they wrote a lot about Mexico specifically, and thought a lot about race relations there, and also US imperialism there. And then when the Zapatista uprising happens, they really oriented towards Mexico to say the Zapatistas are the example that we need to follow in the 1990s. And they, the 11 Rage chapter there, Amor Rabia, interviewed Subcomandante Marcos and many other Zapatistas, and these were printed in US newspapers. They established a movement house in Chiapas, which engaged in a variety of projects to support the Zapatistas. So they are very active there. Beyond Mexico, their main connection was with autonomous social movements in Europe, especially the Autonomen in Germany, like squatters networks in Berlin. And so there were a lot of direct connections there, and they were really inspired by the Autonomen's focus on building autonomy in the present in these liberated social spaces within squats, and thinking about how that is both a different way to live in the present in kind of this ontological sense, right, of a new way of being in the world, but also then that could intervene in broader political issues. And the last thing they'll say is that they also, many of them made a distinction between saying, okay, outside of the United States, the most important issue in terms of race is imperialism, right? Like that is the structure of how race operates at a world scale alongside capitalism, versus in the United States, it's structures of white supremacy. And that these are two different things, right? Even though they're very intimately connected, and they require different kinds of organizing and resistance against them. So they more or less supported national liberation struggles and kind of traditional anti-imperialism, but with anarchist critiques outside of the United States, and also to a degree in what they saw as internal colonies in the United States, especially in Black communities, but said that this isn't necessarily the right way to approach political resistance to white supremacy in the United States. And so we have to think of other ways to do that. So they were definitely thinking about this and trying to think in a global sense and about how to resist in different contexts and to link up with groups in other places that were doing similar things. Let's see, and I guess I need to call on the next. We have Shane Capra.
Hey, thanks y'all. Yeah, I guess I agree with a lot of what Spencer was saying about punk sort of being one of the many areas where the seeds got saved in the seed bank for some of these politics, with all the baggage that came with it. But I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask was like, you know, I think part of the having it be more subsumed in these cultural politics, and especially youth cultures, meant that a lot of people basically last like 5 years tops or something. And so the intergenerational transfer, even of like 10 years ago, what was going on in our movements is completely dropped. And I think, I guess this is, you know, a question for all three of you, but like, how is that maintained in these movements via cultural means in non-youth culture ways? And I guess the second thing is, to me, like, I think punk pulled its weight in some ways with ARA and ties to social movement reproduction with ALF and ELF and lots of different things. But do you see that as a changing dynamic now? Do you think it's more dual power and organizational focus than subcultural focus? Check.
I can give a quick answer and then we can go to the rest of the panel. Yeah, I mean, I think youth subculture on the left is a major problem, not just limited to punk, right? But certainly a strong, big problem within punk and anarchism. Love and Rage was almost all, you know, not just white middle class, but like white middle class 20-somethings. And it's like the same base that we see of a lot of anarchist organizing today, right? Of downwardly mobile white youth. Which is not to say that that's the only organizing that takes place. I'm a historian. I think that events like this are part of what is helping us to preserve these cultures of resistance and to learn from the past and to connect between generations and to build new things for the future. I recommend a Crime Think article, which I'll put in the chat, on the history of punk and the connection with anarchist resistance, because I think that it addresses it way better than I could in terms of the changes after the anti-globalization movement and how the role of punk in connection to anarchism kind of changed after that. But I'll link that in the comments and let the other panelists go.
I added on the chat the links to the exhibition I'm working on, and I will be working in, you know, completing all the information I have. And I invite you to please, you know, we're gonna have blogs. So I invite you as invited authors and to post these questions that are very important. What I've noticed in the second and third generation is they become Americanized. When I contacted the descendants, they didn't know what their parents did, that they saved lives and all that. They are shocked to learn most of the times. So I think a lot of them protected their children because, you know, the FBI visited their houses. Franco agents were, I mean, this lasted until 1977, when the Franco diplomacy lost power here in the United States. So I think the parents were trying to protect their children from being deported, which meant a quick execution on shore. So I think that's what, but it would be very important to continue these conversations in these digital projects with invited blogs. So we find any of these connections that continued in the future. And I keep posting, and I'm happy to collaborate with anybody with my work.
And in the Caribbean, it kind of depends on where you're talking about. In Panama, anarchism pretty much is dead by 1925. There's really nobody around to continue the legacy. In Puerto Rico, it really peters out in the 1930s with the establishment of the Communist Party and the rise of the nationalist movement, and the anarchists really just don't have much presence to pass along intergenerationally. But in Cuba, no, that presence does pass along intergenerationally. And one of the main reasons is because you have these activists who are anarchist activists for so long. De Valle from the 1890s until he dies in the 1940s. Raphael Serra from the 19-teens to the 1950s. Marcelo Salinas from about 1910 until his death in the 1970s. These are people who are activists for 50, 60, almost 70 years that help to continue this generational trend. And people like Salinas, even by the 1950s, is publishing articles about what the anarchists were doing back in the War for Independence in the 1890s, what they were doing against the dictatorships in the 20s, and in relationship to the anti-fascist movements in the 1930s. So this intergenerational transfer is able to survive because of these longtime activists who are keeping it alive and thinking back and bringing people up to speed.
All right, so it's 2:30. We have one more question in the stack, so maybe we can take that and then close it out. Does that sound good to you, Kirk and Montse?
Perfect.
All right, so we have Yona Feldman. I don't know if you're still here and want to. Question is about the fate of Spanish anarchist exile organizations in the U.S., how they maintain themselves, and do they engage with other anarchist movements in the U.S.? Did they have any influence on the anarchist movement more broadly in the years after the Spanish Civil War?
The only one I followed are the ones that were in this confederation of Hispanic societies. There were more or less 200 of them, and they published Frente Popular and then España Libre. So in 1977, when there was this new elections in Spain, the last periodical published said we moved the fight back to Spain. So it was kind of an exile fight. So all these organizations, there was a mixture of labor organization, cultural organization, regional organization. So they developed into cultural organizations, and some of them lost all the left or anarchist or progressive part of them. It would be a good part to keep researching, but I haven't gone too far on that.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, everybody, for coming. Thank you to Kirk Schaefer and Montse Feu for this panel. And I look forward to collaborating more with all of you in the future, hopefully seeing you in person on the streets at some point. And until then, have a good summer. Go jump in some cold water somewhere.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Nice to see everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Are we having an after party?